The True Believer, Thoughts on the Nature of Mass Movements by Eric Hoffer. Part 5, page 41, section 34. A rising mass movement attracts and holds a following not by its doctrine and promises, but by the refuge it offers from the anxieties, barrenness, and meaninglessness of an individual existence. It cures the poignantly frustrated not by conferring on them an absolute truth, or by remedying the difficulties and abuses which made their lives miserable, but by freeing them from their ineffectual selves. And it does this by enfolding and absorbing them into a closely knit and exultant corporate whole. It is obvious, therefore, that in order to succeed, a mass movement must develop at the earliest moment a compact corporate organization and a capacity to absorb and integrate all comers. It is futile to judge the viability of a new movement by the truth of its doctrine and the feasibility of its promises. What has to be judged is its corporate organization for quick and total absorption of the frustrated, where new creeds vie with each other for the allegiance of the populace. The one which comes with the most perfected collective framework wins. Of all the cults and philosophies which competed in the Greco-Roman world, Christianity alone developed from its inception a compact organization. Quote, "No one of its rivals possessed so powerful and coherent a structure as did the Church. No others gave its adherents quite the same feeling of coming into a closely knit community." End quote. The Bolshevik movement outdistanced all other Marxist movements in the race for power because of its tight collective organization. The National Socialist movement, too, won out over all the other folkish movements, which pullulated in the 1920s because of Hitler's early recognition that a rising mass movement can never go too far in advocating and promoting collective cohesion. He knew that the chief passion of the frustrated is, quote, "to belong," end quote, and that there cannot be too much cementing and binding to satisfy this passion. Passage 35. The milieu most favorable for the rise and propagation of mass movements is one in which a once compact corporate structure is, for one reason or another, in a state of disintegration. The age in which Christianity rose and spread was one when large numbers of men were uprooted. The compact city-states had been partly merged into one vast empire, and the old and political groupings had been weakened or dissolved. Christianity made its greatest headway in the large cities, where lived thousands of deracinated individuals, some of them slaves, some freedmen, and some merchants, who had been separated by force or voluntarily from their hereditary milieu. In the countryside, where the communal pattern was least disturbed, the new religion found the ground less favorable. The villagers, pagani, and the heath-dwellers, heathen, clung longest to the ancient cults. A somewhat similar situation is to be observed in the rise of nationalist and socialist movements in the second half of the 19th century. The extraordinary mobility and urbanization of population served to create during those decades an extraordinary number of persons uprooted from ancestral soil and local allegiance. Experiencing grave economic insecurity and psychological maladjustment, these were very susceptible to demagogic propaganda, socialist or nationalist, or both. The general rule seems to be that as one pattern of corporate cohesion weakens, conditions become ripe for the rise of a mass movement and the eventual establishment of a new and more vigorous form of compact unity. When a church, which was all-embracing, relaxes its hold, new religious movements are likely to crystallize. H.G. Wells remarks that, at the time of the Reformation, people objected not to the church's power, but to its weaknesses. Their movements against the church, within it and without, were movements not for release from a religious control, but for a fuller and more abundant religious control. If the religious mood is undermined by enlightenment, the rising movements will be socialist, nationalist, or racist. The French Revolution, which was also a nationalist movement, came as a reaction not against the vigorous tyranny of the Catholic Church and the ancient regime, but against their weakness and ineffectuality. When people revolt in a totalitarian society, they rise not against the wickedness of the regime, but its weakness. Where the corporate pattern is strong, it is difficult for a mass movement to find a footing. The communal compactness of the Jews, both in Palestine and the diaspora, was probably one of the reasons that Christianity made so little headway among them. The destruction of the temple caused, if anything, a tightening of the communal bonds. The synagogue and the congregation received now much of the devotion which formerly flowed toward the temple and Jerusalem. Later, when the Christian church had the power to segregate the Jews in ghettos, it gave their communal compactness an additional reinforcement and thus, unintentionally, ensured the survival of Judaism intact through the ages. The coming of enlightenment undermined both orthodoxy and ghetto walls. Suddenly, and perhaps for the first time since the days of Job and Ecclesiastes, the Jew found himself an individual, terribly alone in a hostile world. There was no collective body he could blend with and lose himself in. The synagogue and the congregation had become shriveled, lifeless things, while the traditions and prejudices of 2,000 years prevented his complete integration with the Gentile corporate bodies. Thus, the modern Jew became the most autonomous of individuals, and, inevitably, too, the most frustrated. It is not surprising, therefore, that the mass movement of modern times often found him a ready convert. The Jew also crowded the roads leading to palliatives of frustration, such as hustling and migration. He also threw himself into a passionate effort to prove his individual worth by material achievements and creative work. There was, it is true, one speck of corporateness he could create around himself by his own efforts, namely, the family. And he made the most of it. But in the case of the European Jew, Hitler chewed and scorched this only refuge in concentration camps and gas chambers. Thus, now, more than ever before, the Jew, particularly in Europe, is the ideal potential convert. And it almost seems providential that Zionism should be on hand in the Jew's darkest hour to enfold him in its corporate embrace and cure him of his individual isolation. Israel is indeed a rare refuge. It is home and family, synagogue and congregation, nation and revolutionary party, all in one. The recent history of Germany also furnishes an interesting example of the relation between corporate compactness and a receptivity to the appeal of mass movements. There was no likelihood of a genuine revolutionary movement arising in Wilhelminian Germany. The Germans were satisfied with the centralized authoritarian Kaiser regime, and even defeat in the First World War did not impair their love for it. The Revolution of 1918 was an artificial thing with little popular backing. The years of the Weimar Constitution, which followed, were for most Germans a time of irritation and frustration. Used as they were to commands from above and respect for authority, they found the loose, irreverent democratic order all confusion and chaos. They were shocked to realize that they had to participate in government, choose a party, and pass judgment upon political matters. They longed for a new corporate whole, more monolithic, all-embracing and glorious to behold than even the Kaiser regime had been, and the Third Reich more than answered their prayer. Hitler's totalitarian regime, once established, was never in danger of mass revolt. So long as the ruling Nazi hierarchy was willing to shoulder all responsibilities and make all decisions, there was not the least chance for any popular antagonism to arise. A danger point could have been reached had Nazi discipline and its totalitarian control been relaxed. What de Tocqueville says of a tyrannical government is true of all totalitarian orders. Their moment of greatest danger is when they begin to reform. That is to say, when they begin to show liberal tendencies. Another and final illustration of the thesis that effective collective bodies are immune to the appeal of mass movement, but that a crumbling collective pattern is the most favorable milieu for their rise, is found in the relation between the collective body we know as an army and mass movements. There is hardly an instance of an intact army giving rise to a religious, revolutionary, or nationalist movement. On the other hand, a disintegrating army, whether by the orderly process of demobilization or by desertion due to demoralization, is fertile ground for a proselytizing movement. The man just out of the army is an ideal potential convert, and we find him among the early adherents of all contemporary mass movements. He feels alone and lost in the free-for-all of civilian life. The responsibilities and uncertainties of an autonomous existence weigh and prey upon him. He longs for certitude, camaraderie, freedom from individual responsibility, and a vision of something altogether different from the competitive free society around him. And he finds all this in the brotherhood and the revivalist atmosphere of a rising movement.